Well, there we are, ladies and gentlemen. I fear that I have some technology problems, so I am unable to open my screen or my notes, but I'm hoping that we will be able to move on now to our next question, our next polling question. And that next polling question, I hope, is with you now, and it is it up there on the screen? Let's just see. Yes, it is up there on the screen. Compared to someone without diabetes, how much more likely is someone living with diabetes to develop heart disease? Is there no difference in the risk? Are they up to twice as likely, 4 times more likely, 6 times more likely, or you have no idea? Or vote now, please. Okay, could we move on? You've given me control back again. No, there we go. Okay, so I think we are going to be hearing more about that in our next presentation. So I'm going to leave you in limbo for a little while. It gives me great pleasure now to hand over to Professor Thomas Wascher, who is a diabetologist from Austria. You've heard about him already, you've heard from him briefly already, and also to Dr. Ricardo Fontes Carvalho. He is a cardiologist from Portugal, and they will be discussing how type 2 diabetes people with type 2 diabetes can best manage their disease in collaboration with their treating physician. Can I hand over to you, gentlemen? You're on mute, Professor Thomas.
Thought I would be unmuted. Okay, let's try again. Thank you very much, Sarah. What I would like to do in the next couple of minutes is give to you some overview on diabetes as a problem itself and on diabetes as a problem for the patient's heart. Might I have the next slide, please? Since I'm not in control. Yeah, you've already seen that. This is a world map that comes from the International Diabetes Federation atlas that is updated regularly. What you can see here is the 2019 version. And virtually in every region of the world, the figures for diabetes increase dramatically. And you have already heard this increase is almost exclusively based on an increase of what we call type 2 diabetes, which is one of the special forms, I'll come to that a little later, of diabetes. And it's itself a disease that imposes an incredible burden on the vasculature, on the blood vessels of the patient. So the next, please. Next slide, please. Yeah. We front up, I think we have to define a little bit what diabetes is, because if people hear about diabetes, they tend to have the opinion that diabetes is a homogeneous disease, which in fact is not the case. It's a heterogeneous group of disease conditions, and all of them have in common that blood glucose concentrations are increased. And all of them have in common that patients who suffer from diabetes subsequently have an increased morbidity and have a premature mortality. And as already said, 90% of them have type 1 diabetes, up to 10% have type 1 diabetes, and you can figure out easily all the other types of diabetes that exist are kind of rare diabetes forms. So that's one side. Type 2 diabetes is the most common form of diabetes, and type 2 diabetes gets dramatically increased. What is the reason for that increase in diabetes we see worldwide? And you can see the reason on the next slide that we have in a moment. There is 2 very important aspects. One of them is the genetic background, and the other one is the lifestyle. So genetic background, of course, doesn't change over a period of, let's say, 10 to 20 to 30 years. on one hand, and on the other hand, genetic background, specifically with regard to be efficient in using fuel we have as humans, predisposes us, so to say, to diabetes, because mankind, for its entire existence, let's say up to 100 years ago, was faced with periods of enough fuel and periods of hunger, of famine. So being efficiently in using fuels, in using calories, was an advantage for, let's say, the entire duration of human development up to 100 years ago. So now, for most of us, fortunately, there is no famine anymore, there is no hunger, we have enough calories. Then comes into game lifestyle. That has changed a lot. What we can say now is that in most developed but also developing communities, people tend to be overfeeded. We have an abundance of calories, and perhaps even more important, we are undermoved. Not because we do not move in our free time, we do not move in sports or whatever, but very many communities changed from producing communities to service-oriented communities. So we do not move anymore during our work time. We sit around, we stand around, but we do not move, we do not produce anymore. And those two conditions very much increase the prevalence of diabetes, because they, first of all, increase the prevalence of obesity. And if your genetic background goes into the direction of diabetes, of type 2 diabetes, this subsequently increases type 2 diabetes. So may I have the next, please? I would like to provide to you information from two very important studies that highlight the problem we face at the moment. Next, please. Whoever is there and could give me the next slide. Well, actually, we see we have a little problem. What I would have loved to show you is the development of the risk for cardiovascular disease and other diabetes-associated complications in the United States of America over a period of 20 years. It would be quite nice now to have the next slide. Yes, thank you very much. So what you can see here on the graph is the change in the incidence of diabetes-associated complications in the US from 1990 to 2010. And it is very easy to see that some of those complications, for example, myocardial infarction or stroke or amputations, have a big decline. MI, for example, 140 out of 10,000 patients in a year faced a myocardial infarction in 1990, only 46 not. In 1990, there was an estimated 6.5 million people living with diabetes in the US. In 2010, it was 20.7. So a more than threefold increase in a time period in that the population in the US increased by only 27%. This shows you both sides of the medal. On one side, there's traumatic progress for an individual patient. On the other side, there is not so much progress, if not regress, for healthcare systems. So things went better. Are they solved? Not yet, which you could see on the next slide, please. This is now data from Europe I showed to you. This is from the famous Swedish diabetes registry. What you can see there is death rates from cardiovascular disease, left panel type 1 diabetes, right panel type 2 diabetes. And there are several things to be seen on that slide. First of all, let me start on the right-hand side for type 2 diabetes. Things go better for patients with, in blue, and without, in red, diabetes. And you can see that the gap between subjects with diabetes and without diabetes narrows over time, but still, if somebody suffers from type 2 diabetes, the risk for death from cardiovascular disease is dramatically increased. Let's move to the left side. This is type 1 diabetes, and this is to me very important too. Even if type 1 diabetes is much less frequent than type 2 diabetes, and patients with type 1 diabetes are much younger than patients with type 2 diabetes, we tend to forget that also type 1 diabetes is associated with a dramatic, even bigger increase in cardiovascular risk. What you can see also is that the gap between the blue and the red line narrows over time. And please do not oversee that the x-axis on the left side ends by 60 and on the right side by 250, meaning, yes, type 1 diabetic patients, because they are much younger and less confounding risk factors, have a lower absolute risk, but in comparison to subjects at the same age, the same sex, the same risk factor constellation without type 1 diabetes, there is a dramatically increased risk. Next slide, please. So type 2 diabetes can cause complications to various parts of the body, and most of those complications are based on vascular disease. You have already heard about cardiovascular disease, which is the main cause of death for people with type 2 diabetes. There is diabetes-associated eye disease, and diabetes-associated eye disease is the most frequent cause of blindness in first world countries. There is kidney disease. Still, type 2 diabetes is the most frequent cause why somebody in a developed country needs to go on dialysis or suffers from end-stage renal disease. There's nerve damage as a complication of diabetes, and the consequence of nerve damage together with vascular disease is the problem of the diabetic foot, meaning nerve damage and perfusion deficits predispose subjects with diabetes to complications on their feet. And again, the diabetic foot syndrome is the most frequent cause for atraumatic amputations in developed countries. So type 2 diabetes, beside heart disease, imposes a lot of disease burden on patients that is based on vascular disease, and preventing, to a certain extent, preventing cardiovascular disease in patients with diabetes means also preventing other complications in patients with diabetes. And having said that, with the next slide, I would like to hand over to my colleague Ricardo.